All right. Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining our side event entitled Connecting the Dots Between Human Rights and Climate Change, Pathways to a Just and Fair Adaptation at such an early hour. We are very grateful to the Nordic Pavilion for graciously offering us this platform at COP26 to organize this event, which is aimed at raising awareness of the interlinkages between human rights and climate change adaptation and putting human rights at the heart of the climate change agenda. We would also like to thank our sponsors, the Swedish International Development Cooperation Agency, without whose support this event could not happen. Before we go into the topic of today, please allow me to introduce myself and the organization I represent, the Raoul Wallenberg Institute of Human Rights and Humanitarian Law, RWI. RWI is a research and academic institute headquartered in Lund, Sweden, with offices and programs covering 40 countries around the world. RWI works on evidence-based human rights research and direct engagement to contribute to a wider understanding of and respect for human rights and international humanitarian law, including human rights in climate change contexts. RWI started its work in Asia 25 years ago, which has since then transformed into a regional program aimed at strengthening the mutually reinforcing protections of human rights, gender equality, and the environment to achieve just, inclusive, and sustainable development. There, we work across three thematic streams encompassing human rights and environment, localizing SDGs and human rights, and people on the move. RWI has, among many things, published a series of research papers on human rights and the environment, including the thematic study on the right to healthy environment in Southeast Asia, and spearheaded a number of capacity-building initiatives, such as our blended learning courses on human rights and the environment and climate change that have reached over 150 representatives from the government, courts, the private sector, and universities across Asia and the Pacific. My name is Victor Bernard, and I am the RWI's main focal point on issues related to human rights and the environment in Asia and the Pacific, where I am, among many things, spearheading the research initiative on human rights and national adaptation plans together with Stockholm Environment Institute. This research has culminated in the discussion brief entitled Pathways to Just and Fair Adaptation, a rights-based approach to national adaptation plans, that provides both state and non-state actors in the adaptation field with guidance on integrating a rights-based approach to climate change adaptation. This brief is available as a hard copy on the table behind you as well as in front of me, and on our website, for which there is a QR code that my highly esteemed colleague will share with you, Ms. Nikita, there in the corner. Now, 85% of the world's population, most of who reside in developing and least developed countries, has experienced extreme weather events exacerbated by climate change. The majority of them are in Asia and the Pacific, which is home to approximately 4.3 billion people and is among the most vulnerable regions to the impacts of climate change. Many Asia-Pacific communities are already experiencing more frequent occurrences of extreme weather conditions, rising sea levels, flooding, and other such climate-induced disasters. Heavily populated and low-lying areas have become increasingly exposed to hazards leading to rising displacement and migration or greater risks for the remaining communities. Climate adaptation is therefore no longer a choice, but an urgent priority to save lives, enhance resilience, and most importantly, protect human rights, and must become a core part of countries' and communities' response to climate change alongside climate mitigation measures. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has warned in its latest report that the adverse effects of climate change are hitting us faster than anticipated, and confirmed that some of the changes in our climate have become irreversible. Without urgent action, the climate crisis will become one of the greatest human rights challenges of our time, exacerbating inequalities and persistent vulnerability and threatening lives and livelihoods. The UN Human Rights Council has recognized that the impacts of climate change will adversely affect the enjoyment of human rights, both directly and indirectly, including rights to life, health, water, food, housing, and an adequate standard of living. Marginalized and disadvantaged groups, including women, children, persons with disabilities, and ethnic minorities, indigenous peoples, are among those who will be disproportionately exposed to the immediate climate risks and shocks, as well as the socioeconomic ramifications that will further exacerbate their vulnerabilities and marginalizations. The Paris Agreement further recognized the link between human rights and climate change in its preamble, which was adopted to advance international cooperation to combat climate change and lead the world down the path to net zero greenhouse gas emissions. Such a link has been re-emphasized by the UN Human Rights Council, the UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights and the Environment, and various human rights treaty bodies. More recently, the Human Rights Council recognized for the very first time the human right to a safe, healthy, and sustainable environment, a right which is at risk of being seriously undermined by climate change. Besides the direct human rights impacts of climate change itself, measures designed to mitigate or adapt to climate change can also negatively affect human rights. Therefore, it is essential to implement a rights-based approach not only to protect people, but also to ensure that actions designed to mitigate and respond to climate change and to remedy its consequences are undertaken while safeguarding the specific needs and challenges faced by all marginalized groups, and also to ensure that the rights of all groups are equally protected and granted a voice and representation in global and national decision-making processes pertaining to climate change adaptation. The discussion brief I mentioned earlier offers concrete guidance in defining the elements, and defines the elements of a rights-based approach and how they can be directly integrated into climate change adaptation and planning. This event marks the start of RWI's work on human rights and climate change adaptation at the global level, where we aim to promote and offer workshops and research in support of various constituencies and policymakers on integrating a rights-based approach to climate change adaptation. Moving on to the agenda for today, this workshop will start with a short movie entitled The Last Breath of the Tonle Sap in Cambodia, produced by Thomas Cristofoletti and Robin Narciso, who won the RWI Asia Pacific Award at the Mini Kino Film Week 7 in 2021. This movie showcases the first-hand experiences of a fishing family living on the edge of the Tonle Sap Lake in Cambodia who are dealing with climate change and other environmental challenges. The family describes food insecurity and socioeconomic challenges as just some of the many issues emerging as a result of increased hydropower activity combined with climate change. The movie will be followed by a presentation by Dr. Sumudu Atapatu, who is the Director of Research Centers, Senior Lecturer at the University of Wisconsin Law School, and an affiliated professor at RWI. She will be setting the stage by showcasing how human rights and climate change are interconnected. Following this, we will be joined by Ms. Nicole Anschell, who is the former research associate at the Stockholm Environment Institute and current grant manager for the Norwegian Refugee Council, who will showcase how a rights-based approach can be integrated into national adaptation planning, drawing from the initial findings of RWI's and SEI's joint research. The final session will follow a highly interactive format featuring a scenario related to climate-induced displacement and relocation and their effects on human rights, which you will discuss with your peers and present with us today. Without further ado, I would like to please start the movie. Yeah. Oh, no. There's no sound.
toàn này khi toàn co tịch đi đào
Nè,
đào này co lên đi đào
cơ có ai nơi không việc lần rầy
Piper lại
co lại bàn tay ấp đăng thạch rây nắng cuồng côn đây biết nà hay một năm nắng cuồngประมาณ đòn ấp đăng này co tận thiệt thì pru nè phần này thì pru thì crum
chứ bà lần cột răng không có nhỉ cột mấy cột thì nó
là cái tao tao thì crum mong đằng
còn thế
thì pru có
qua đi đi co
thì crum mất nào đóng nào thì ngay ôn người ta chạy
ôn ta vay á ôn bia á nhắm rồi hai
bà cái gì á
mà cái hai con lò
Chung mà ăn
bao tu họ
nhóm chung sọc bị sệt một là bò và nhóm cứ nề sạt nhóm thôi chứ nề sạt tây ní tăng pi quan mùi cái tapi brom beran đôn ta máu cứ cái cà phê tây lịch tắc này để chi chấm rộ sạt tây tuông còn cài khá đàm chong ấy cục phết chẳng bớt sân là chỉ về là hao than ở miền tây vinh tây có việc nào đây đầm nơi ở miền nơi tí này đấy việc ruột tận nơi cái kê ngày chẳng dưng ở miền buông cồn to nơi này to bà này bộ nhóm nè nơi ruột nơi đầm bòn tây sáng tới cả tận sập nắm rồi về nó khai ní rồi đời cả ní ắt miền panh hai thì cả thôn nào từ nữa sưu rồi còn hôm nay về khấy thầy chè mà mau ấy ai đừng đo lại để dương trời rô trời này để lấy hôm nay về mà mau cái lá rồi đó pi mau bạn ai đo lại dương từ này sạt bạn bánh hà thì mũi cái rừng tật ngày nhầm tay giấy nó tật Việt miền nó pe tật ở miền máu tây Việt miền lang Việt lề tật tịnh tây Việt màu ở rùi đằng đầu đầu pe bồi gì bị sập đam nhom nơi bị khmei bính khai cầm buôn khai đập mùi tật lề hồ lang vương châu đông sơn cái dương nơi ra ngày nữa cho bọn miền tật nó cần phải chọc khăn chương đi thì cần phải đánh buộc khăn chương đi thì đánh bay khăn chương đi thì pro hà phụ nâng việt phơi oi pa pa nâng phụ nhom nè nơi tờ lê này khăn rồi thà về miền Pành Hà mau pi cái phơi cái bật phơi về ria cái sini à cho con tật dương để trời là đôi sập nam nó cái bật rồi cái bật tới tật nó bị tịch về tịch khăn nên mình đai flap chủ nói tăng với nhau đăng cái đây mà mình đai flap chủ mà sao mình nó để từ này sạt nó bàn tuồng nó chìm nùn mà cái lầu bàn tuồng đã lon nữa bàn mà cái lầu này là từ bài từ hàng muông nó bên bàn buộc mùi tây mùi cái lầu đây khó về thì muốn khơi nhầm này về là phần nắng loàn dương tràn phần nắng muông dương tràn phần nắng ban tràn dương nắng bàn tây nó đo từ đọc lâu bàn tuồng nó bay buồn cái lâu tại năm nay ớt men chân ngày qua là nghe bàn mà cái lâu phần nắng khoa khlang một chặt cùn này cái đây vẹt chênh trong ta đau chênh nhỏ ngay ô phốt aka tục lùm bạ nâng là độc
rồi ta bài mà hộp gì ở trong toàn liền chỉ là đam trai rồi ngay dù đây cái đam trai rồi cả đám cái mai ta ban cái mau mà anh cái mai ta ban mì pin nhẹ rồi ta thơ cá mình ta nè đi nhom đá nè cái ọt gì tới cho nhau mà buồn đậm mơn tới nhom khát tới
này còn khi mua chăn thơ ní thơ ca nở pin ní thơ ca nông tia bài còn ôn ní thơ ca nở nông hang lộ bài lộ bọc là hông lộ bổng tia cồn cồn thông pin với ắt miền mục bò ai cồn rố miền ta ai cồn tình chẳng ai đập bay vượt cùng nó không hô xa đại chặt ai cồn từ thưa ca cái tới bàn bàn lui màu chân đôi chỉ mà đai tha cồn ơi này bữa sân chỉ cồn thưa bán cả bàn lui cồn anh ta lẹ bạ mà đai mà đai tình bơ pro sớm mai lớn này ta lẹ miền cà pơ thì miền mục miền mọt rồi đòi châu mà phải chụp bòn đi việc đôi ở miền tầm lái cứ chọc tầm nặng ta trên là gì trên lại về tình hù ta hơi từ ngày bữa sân đi bàn thái lỗ ăn tục tê mình thật tục thì mấy hay ao về xí không mà ngày bữa thà tình ao xí không ngày bông pram đậm mờ thấy tê tới côn ơi ăn miền nuôi ở cái bờ xí tê con này đã nuôi ai mai mà tình anh mọt con ai phong anh mọt cái bờ phong bữa thà dừng châm mình đạo về xí với ngọt đàn đai rồi bữa tình về mà hơi mình ta
nhom pruy baram đây đà ca phi khai rồi dương ọt clean này chẳng tới dương từ rồi chưa bol kề ấy từ ở bịa kế này bây giờ men cô đại hoàn nhóm như men vị thị sa là không chặt nhom hay năng nhom riệp rạp rạp có quân nhom côn chạy nhom đuổi sải nhom thà từ thôi dạng mấy đây mình ao bịa kề chung từ thằng nẹp xây này kia bịa tràn đó thằng nào rập pan $1 rập $10 được xa cái năng vô smạch cái mùi mùi nó mình còn ấy cái vô mùi tiền được chị smạch này chị đào mình chẳng nhâm sức chất đâu ọt nhâm ra tụ trả nhâm ổng ra cầm làng bài chứ tới nhâm ở ban chị bịa kia được xa được là nhâm sức chất hạ ọt đánh hạt nhâm ở chị bịa kia tí nhưng mà đằng thật luôn nhâm sập ngày nào chẳng nhâm tròn ở con tụi những như mẹ nà cuột ở che đằng đôi bòn chẳng ở trong ở về đôi nhau mẹ nhau mấy với là ngon rồi nhưng mà bàn riêng sâu để chơi hỏi mẹ là cả bàn riêng sâu là cái che đằng chơi là cái nâng ai từ thứ ca nghe Rosie ấy đừng mạch pra cầm lăng bài đôi ở bé pra cầm lăng bài hồi như hồi chiêm hạ phliêng hạ trò
All right. So this gave, this gave us a human face to some of the environmental challenges that we are facing in Southeast Asia and in other parts of the world. So I would like to hand over the floor to my highly esteemed colleague, Dr. Sumudha Tapatu. I will set up the presentation while she gets ready. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Victor. Can you guys hear me? Yeah, okay, great. Okay, so thank you so much for coming this early. And how is everybody feeling? Enjoying COP? Yeah? Good. So I'm going to talk to you about climate change and human rights, linking the two. So I'm at University of Wisconsin Law School, as you can see. I'm also affiliated with the Raoul Wallenberg Institute. How does this work? Maybe the batteries? Off. No, I'll go there and do it. Yeah? Yeah. No, that's fine. I don't need to sit. It's fine. Okay, so connecting the dots. As you heard from Victor, there was a very recent development that recognized for the very first time a human right to a healthy environment under international law. As you may know, right to a healthy environment has been recognized under various constitutions, national constitutions, and at the regional level, but this was the first time that a right to a healthy environment was recognized at the international level. So it's a great achievement for those of us who have been working in this field for so long. So this is my outline. So I will talk a little bit about the adverse consequences of climate change, and then talk a little bit about human rights, what human rights have been recognized under international law, and then try and connect the two to show how climate change affects all these rights that are recognized under human rights law, and then also look at the disproportionate impact on vulnerable communities and states, and how we can protect their rights and give them a voice at the international level, as well as at the national level by adopting a human rights framework. I probably won't get to the legal framework, but I will talk a little bit about the Paris Agreement and the provision on human rights there. And if we have time, we'll get to the loss and damage mechanism. I will put my timer so that I don't talk forever. So a few years ago, Mary Robinson, who I'm sure you all know, said that she believes that climate change is the biggest threat to human rights in the 21st century, right? And why did she say this? So this is what we are trying to unpack here at this presentation. So if you look at the consequences of climate change, and Victor referred to them briefly in his remarks, and these consequences have been established by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change and various scientists, as well as the medical community recently, who said that climate change is a serious threat to health. So there will be water scarcity, and we are already experiencing these consequences: food scarcity, flooding and drought, right? Increased severe weather events, and this is something we are experiencing already. We have seen so many severe weather events across the world. And climate change is contributing both to the frequency as well as the severity of these severe weather events. Sea level rise associated with warming seas and melting glaciers. And as a result, there will be an inundation of low-lying areas and possibly complete submergence of small island states. And I will talk a little bit about them later. And then there will be health impacts. As I said, the community of doctors said recently that the climate change is the biggest threat to health. So there will be increased incidence of vector-borne diseases, heat waves, waterborne diseases, and the mental health impacts are huge, but that's an understudied area. Loss of ecosystem services, we depend on the ecosystem for our day-to-day survival. And with biodiversity loss, which is also connected to climate change and other land use changes, the ecosystem services that we depend on for our life and existence will be decreased as well. And we have also seen increased wildfires. So I have some pictures to show you, and these images are becoming more and more frequent. And then this shows the change in water availability, droughts and desertification. And this was Typhoon Haiyan in the Philippines in 2013, which is considered to be the biggest ever typhoon to make landfall. Sea level rise, small island states, and very recently, Canada recorded its highest temperature ever. And these are some pictures from there. British Columbia saw 50-degree temperatures very, very recently. Several people died. So you can just imagine, and this is just the beginning. The Earth has warmed 1.1 degrees Celsius already, and this is a permanent increase in temperature. And imagine what a 2-degree increase would look like if 1.1 is causing this level of havoc. Bushfires in Australia again last year and early this year. And we saw these horrifying images of animals being killed and of course the impact on people. Hurricane Maria in Puerto Rico in 2017. Imagine rebuilding life after something like this, right? How do you rebuild your life after something like this? So, you saw what the consequences of climate change are like, right? And this is only the beginning. Things are only going to get worse because, as Victor pointed out, the latest IPCC report, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, said that no matter what we do, we have locked in 30 years of adverse consequences because of the emissions that are already there. So adaptation is the key. We cannot do anything about those consequences unless, of course, we develop technology to sequester carbon and do all sorts of things with the environment, which I'm not advocating for that because we don't really know the consequences of geoengineering. But I feel that right now we might have to look at all the options. So what are human rights, right? So states have accepted a set of obligations to protect the rights of their citizens. And there are various international treaties that are applicable, but the three main instruments are the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which was adopted after the Second World War in 1948. Of course, it's a declaration, so it's technically not binding. Many of those provisions were included in the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights and the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, both of which were adopted in 1966. And in addition to these main treaties, there are specialized treaties governing groups like women, children, indigenous peoples, disabled people, migrant workers, etc., and specialized topics like torture, racial discrimination, and enforced disappearances. So if you look at the list of rights, and this is not an exhaustive list, of course, rights that are protected under international law, starting with the supreme right to life, right not to be tortured, right to health, right to privacy and family life, right to water and sanitation, right to food, right to an adequate standard of living, housing, etc. You will see, remember the list of consequences we saw earlier, you will see a very close correlation with the rights that we are talking with water scarcity, food scarcity. You can see how these consequences actually affect the rights that are protected under human rights law, right? And of course, in addition to those, we have some procedural rights, like right to information. We have right to receive information about things that affect our lives. Right to a remedy. We have a right to participate in the decision-making process, and right to a nationality that would be affected if some of these small island states become uninhabitable. And then some of the other rights, right to equality and non-discrimination based on race, religion, ethnicity, background, language, etc. And I had to change this slide because I always say, oh, right to a healthy environment is not recognized, but now I can happily say it is recognized by the Human Rights Council. We are hoping that the UN General Assembly will recognize this in a resolution as well. But of course, this is still soft law, which means that because it's a resolution of the Human Rights Council, it's technically not binding, but the recognition has very symbolic value. But even before this recognition, people have used the human rights framework to seek redress for damage caused by environmental issues. So what are the advantages of applying a human rights approach? It gives a human face to the problem, and one of the issues with climate change has been that it seemed very abstract at the beginning. It was considered just an environmental problem, so the impact on human beings, impact on rights was not really addressed, right? And victims of environmental damage can obtain relief under the human rights framework, right? It could influence future claims, and there's cross-fertilization of cases, across human rights bodies as well as different countries, right? And could have implications beyond the case and could influence, hopefully, treaty negotiations as well. So when we look at climate change and human rights specifically, looking at the far-reaching consequences of climate change, we can see that almost all the rights that are protected under human rights law could be affected by climate change, right? As I said, although the link between climate change and human rights is obvious, it was not considered as a human rights issue until quite recently. So the UN Security Council adopted a human rights a resolution on the link, and requested the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights to compile a report on this link, right? All right. So vulnerable groups are disproportionately affected, like women because of the traditional roles and historic marginalization, indigenous groups, again because of historic marginalization as well as their intimate relationship with the land, children and future generations, because obviously they stand to lose and bear the consequences much more than the current generation. And then climate refugees. This is of course not a legal category, but people will be forced to move as a result of climate change. And right now, if they move across borders, there's no legal framework to govern them, because the Geneva Convention on Refugees is applicable only to political refugees. And we also have to think about trapped populations who are unable to move due to poverty, disability, and other social issues, right? So the problem here is that those who contributed least to the problem will be disproportionately affected. So we need to adopt a justice framework to address them. And the Paris Agreement, for the first time, this is the first time that an environmental treaty included a right to a healthy environment, including right to health, and has also provisions on adaptation measures. So to conclude, I was told that I'm out of time. To conclude, climate change obviously is a very complex issue, and sometimes it can seem overwhelming because virtually everything we do contributes to it. Every country, every sector of the economy is contributing, but the problem, of course, right now is that we are fast approaching tipping points. Climate change affects all protected rights, but states have already adopted human rights obligations. They have signed on to these human rights treaties that they are obliged to apply in relation to climate change as well. So whether they take mitigation measures or adaptation measures, they have to apply these human rights obligations that they have already signed on to. So whether COP26 documents refer to human rights or not, human rights are already part of the framework. And it makes total sense to apply human rights, listen to affected communities, get their participation when they're designing these adaptation programs, so that, we don't have problems down the road. We protect their rights from day one. So I will stop with this. Time for words is over. Now we must act. Thank you so much. Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much, Sumudu, for giving us this very comprehensive presentation on human rights and climate change. Now I would like to give the floor to Ms. Nicole Anschel, who will give us a more specific presentation on the rights-based approach in relation to national adaptation plans, drawing from our joint research. The floor is yours.
Yeah.
All right, I'm going to go with this. It works? Hello, my name is Nicole Anschel, and I am here on behalf of the Stockholm Environment Institute, which is a research institute that tries to connect policymakers to research. So today we are here with the RWI, as mentioned, to talk about some research of looking at how human rights are already integrated into existing national adaptation plans. So we've had quite an introduction, so I don't think I need to convince you of the importance of promoting and protecting human rights in the context of climate change. And ultimately, with increasing climate risks, we just want to minimize the number of people impacted by climate change and also make sure they're not being negatively impacted by climate action. So adaptation is key. A key element of climate action and aims to adjust to changes in the ecological and social and economic systems as a result of climate change. So national adaptation plans are key tools for identifying medium and long-term adaptation needs and creating implementation plans. So thus far, we have 22 countries that have submitted their national adaptation plans, and only a handful of them are already in their implementation phase. And so now it's an important opportunity to identify how human rights are already being addressed in national adaptation plans, and then also working to make national adaptation planning processes more inclusive, participatory, and people-centered. So, to the research. This study aimed to, or the objective was quite simple, and we just wanted to see how human rights are already integrated into the national adaptation planning process, and to map how rights have been directly and indirectly referenced, and ultimately identify entry points for how human rights principles can inform and design the implementation of adaptation plans. To do this, we looked at different human rights declarations and instruments in order to identify a number of keywords. And so this included a search string with things like freedom, participation, justice, health, food, and others, dignity. We then did a manual search for each of these terms and recorded how many times the term was mentioned in the document, and then went through each reference to see whether or not the keyword actually was referencing a human right and in what capacity. And then in the analysis, we did a bit of sorting to see which countries mentioned which rights or rights-based principles and when. So in this research, there are 22 NAPs as of June of this year, and we only were able to look at the ones in English, but this just gives us an idea of what rights are in some of the plans. So as you can see here, there are 15 in English, outlined in green, and the plans ranged in 70 pages to about 300. They were all different in their structure, but they often included the plan's development process, observed and projected climate impacts, some of the adaptation objectives, sometimes specifically outlining the needs of different groups, and then monitoring and evaluation. So in these plans, we found all sorts of things, lots of key terms, lots of plans, lots of data. So of note, human rights was only mentioned in 5 plans in any way, the term human rights, and 2 in ways that we would consider a bit more substantive. So in the Brazil plan, they mentioned the human rights of indigenous peoples, as well as recent policies related to the human right to food. In Fiji's plan, their human rights were outlined a bit more specifically, with 2 sections mentioning human rights and gender, and then 1 on human rights-based approaches specifically. Then you'll see rights are mentioned in 11 of the 15 NAPs, and so this kind of getting into the nitty-gritty of talking about a right to a healthy environment, indigenous rights, right to education, child rights. And so, as mentioned, the term right was used in these instances. And then we get into the indirect references. And so I think gender equality is an important one to mention, because while you can see a number of countries mention the right to equality or women's rights, many other NAPs also mentioned the importance of equality in plan implementation or equality in some other way, but didn't necessarily say rights. So some of the terms commonly listed in the NAPs were mentions of equality, as I mentioned, access to information, food security, water security, and health. And if we think about it, this lines up with a lot of key adaptation measures, talking about food or water. And then other mentions that maybe weren't so prevalent, but in some of the NAPs were education, justice, culture, movement, and also quality of life. Other key terms or human rights principles that were not mentioned in any of the NAPs were dignity, due process, self-determination, fair trial, or expression. And so these are all kind of just really looking at words here, but then also thinking a bit more of why some things might be included in adaptation planning and why others not, and perhaps what also some of the benefits could be to integrating more human rights principles into adaptation planning. One thing that I found quite interesting was that a number of plans also mentioned the country's national constitution, which perhaps while not using rights-based language, does talk about some of the national obligations to citizens of that country. So, lots of information, but we did find a few key things. First of all, as you probably noticed, few countries directly mention human rights, let alone in a way that guides the process. And we think that this is an area that can be improved, especially with even going to how the adaptation plans are being drafted, but including more participatory processes, which many countries do have, but just in a broader sense. And then, while there are a lot of indirect references to human rights, there are in different themes like food, water, and health, we are also curious of what it would look like to use a more strategic, rights-based approach to these different themes and how that might be more inclusive and also give a more holistic approach. And finally, as I mentioned, all about systematically including human rights. And so while this research showed a lot of ways that references to rights are there, there's a lot of space for us to work with policymakers to ensure that human rights principles are more present in these plans and ultimately in implementation. So going forward, we have a few ideas. First of all, RWI has mentioned, and I also mentioned, that our organizations really want to work with policymakers. So by looking at this research and also in our plans moving forward, we'd like to work with policymakers to see how human rights might be better or more present in their adaptation planning. We'd also, and this goes towards our second thing of integrating stronger human rights language and really building off of what we've seen from the adaptation plans that already exist to think about what the best way to be the most inclusive and safeguard human rights. And just as Victor mentioned at the start of his talk, RWI and SEI are going to take this forward based on our own recommendations and hope to create a guidance for how countries might be able to more systematically include human rights into their adaptation planning, and then working directly with policymakers specifically in the Southeast Asia region to ensure that this can happen, or see how policymakers would be interested in including it. So, with that, I thank you all for being here so early in the morning and look forward to any discussion after the event of why this is important and how we can make it happen. Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much, Nicole, for giving us such an interesting overview of the findings from our research. So please stay tuned for the research paper that will be coming out later this year as well as early next year. We will have a manual coming out as well. Now I would like to give the floor back to Dr. Samudu, who will go through a real-life scenario, and we would also invite the audience to contribute with their insights and thoughts. And do feel free to help yourself to some cookies in the back as well whilst we are moving in these last 15 minutes.
So I don't know whether this is working. Can you guys hear me? Yeah, okay, great. So I put a scenario together just to show how human rights can be implicated in a real life situation. Of course, this is a fictional situation, but it's very real life too, so I don't know how much you can see. So I will read this. Indigo is a small coastal village in a Pacific island state inhabited mainly by people indigenous to the country. Their main livelihood is fishing. The village consists of about 50 families, most of whom have lived there their entire lives. The ancestors have lived there for centuries. The economy of the whole village revolves around fishing. Of late, major storms have ravaged the country, and flooding is a frequent occurrence. Villagers find that it's becoming increasingly dangerous to go out to the sea due to storms that are becoming unpredictable. They can no longer rely on their traditional knowledge of the sea. Their fish yield is also getting smaller, and the exotic fish they used to catch, which is part of their traditional diet, seems to have disappeared. So looking at the first paragraph, can you think about some of the rights that are implicated here? Some of the rights that we discussed earlier in my presentation? Anybody? And I mean, situations like this are already happening, right? And you saw in the movie too, the documentary we saw earlier, you know, how his fishing practices have been affected, contributing to poverty. The entire family is suffering as a result, right? So the villagers are getting impoverished. The frequent flooding is destroying their homes. Recent storms associated storm surges have claimed the lives of several children. Rights of children are affected. Finally, local authorities decided to move the entire village to a different location, right? So so-called planned relocation. No villager was provided with information, right? Nobody was consulted, and they were given only 2 days to pack their things, okay? Hopefully the real life situation is better than this, but I wanted to sort of dramatize this whole thing. Some villagers refused to leave their ancestral land. Some villagers defied the local authorities and decided to move to a different location on their own. But very soon things become even worse in the new location and they become displaced and are forced to move to a different island close by, which is administered by wealthier country included in Annex 1. Sorry, there are some typos here. Annex 1 of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. These villagers are jailed because they entered the country illegally, and they're harassed and beaten in jail, right? So more human rights violations. Their request to apply for refugee status is denied on the ground that they are not fleeing persecution. The majority of the families moved to the new location because the government promised them jobs. However, the new location is in the middle of the country and they have no access to the ocean, right? Remember, these were fishermen. They have no other skills and the promised jobs never materialized. Sounds familiar? Children had to walk long distance to go to school, right? So, as you can see, there are so many human rights violations here, right? They were never consulted, they were never provided with information about where they were going to be relocated, and they are put in the middle of the country where they cannot practice their livelihood, and they have no other skills. The promised jobs never came, so right to a livelihood is affected. And then this community or the group of people that relocated or moved by themselves to a different country are arrested because they are there illegally, right? They are beaten in jail. So more human rights violations, right? And because they are not political refugees, their application for refugee status is denied, right? So these are things that actually happen and can happen many more folds in the future. So you can see how many of these consequences are related to climate change and how human rights can be implicated by issues surrounding climate change. Any questions? And of course, all this contribute to poverty as well, as you pointed out, right? Climate change is making people poorer for many, many reasons, right? Yeah.
We had, I'm from ATD Fort Worth, we are human rights.
No, I
based.
can't hear.
Okay, I'm sorry.
Thank you.
I'm from ATD Fort Worth. We are a human rights-based organization working in 30 countries with very poor families. We have exactly the same situations, for example, in the Philippines, where we know a lot of people living under the bridges,
right,
and who were relocated 50 kilometers away in a place where they were promised to have a job, where they were promised to have a school and health facilities, but nothing was over there.
Right.
And they were obliged to go there. And after several months, they left and they came back living under the bridges. They were accused for coming back and not having accepted the help that was generously offered by the government.
Right.
And there was a lot of questions also. They lost dignity, they lost work, they lost family cohesion, they lost a bit of community life they had under the bridges because they were relocated on several places, etc. So one of the things we are defending a lot is the right to participation and really to have programs that listen to these people, because all these questions are very interrelated, and as you say, all human rights are interrelated, and if you only take one of it and try to solve it, you can harm other human rights just next to it. So participation is one of the only things where you can have that holistic approach you are speaking about. So I'm very glad hearing this introduction, because it's really very relevant on the ground with the people we are working with. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that intervention.
Can you hear me? Yeah.
Can you speak a little?
Oh yeah, sorry. Can you hear me? Yeah, no, I'm from the National University of Ireland in Galway, and thank you very much. It was a really interesting talk and video and everything. I thought it was very useful about national adaptation planning. And I suppose my question is really just, well, I suppose a comment really, like how can we, I don't know who we is, but how can we ensure that local authorities and institutional level people are aware of these rights? Because that's a challenge. And even if they're aware, how can we help to ensure, not help, but how can they be implemented, let's say, these rights? That's the challenge, I guess, yeah?
Yeah, so that's why we are actually Raoul Wallenberg Institute has been working with some of the national human rights institutions, NGOs, and various other groups to raise awareness about the rights, because even sometimes judges don't know what the rights are, or I mean they might know human rights and environmental law but might not make the connections. So yeah, I've been raising awareness is really important. There might be NGOs who are working on these issues, and even NGOs tend to compartmentalize these issues. So I think it's very important to show them that these issues are connected. And also, raise awareness among the people as well, so that they know what their rights are. So, I mean, I think all of us have a role to play in this, trying to raise awareness among as many people as possible, and get away from this silo mentality we have, which we cannot do in something like climate change. It's all connected and interrelated. Yeah.
Thanks. I don't know if you're able to hear me through the headphones. Great. So my name is Amanda. I'm with the UN Office for Human Rights. Thank you all for the very interesting presentations. And I have, I guess, two sort of comments or additions and then one question, building actually on the two latest points that we were just hearing about: participation, meaningful participation, and also, what are some of the other actors in the human rights and climate change ecosystems that can be engaged in working on this. And I just wanted to flag as well for those that are not already following this, that in addition to the, of course, very exciting developments at the Human Rights Council, and thank you to the speakers for highlighting this, a lot of national human rights institutions are also increasingly engaging on issues around climate change. And the Global Alliance for National Human Rights Institutions had its latest annual conference focusing on climate change and adopted a statement, an outcome decision based on that, and are now establishing a caucus on climate change. So I think that's another sort of exciting development to be looking towards. At the office, we are working with GANRI and other colleagues, including at the UN Environment Programme and UNDP, under also a framework of something called the Secretary General's Call to Action for Human Rights. And that action program has a dedicated area on climate justice and rights of future generations. And I think that's another element. It was brought up in the presentations as well, but to link back also to rights to meaningful participation and rights of children and youth as well in that context. So just thank you very much to all of the speakers. And I would be interested in hearing a little bit more about how you're hoping to take the manual that you're developing forward, that was mentioned a little bit by all of the speakers as well. Thank you so much.
Thank you for that intervention. Yeah.
I can just briefly answer with regards to the manual. I mean, it's a work in progress, and we're consulting with the stakeholders we're trying to target, so I can't really say exactly how that will look like, since, of course, we are all bound by this consultation-based research. But I hope that there will be a manual that they can use, similar to the gender manual, as well as the one for indigenous peoples, but one that encompasses all groups that haven't been addressed as of yet. And we're working with Southeast Asian national adaptation planners, but we're trying to expand in that region, and then hopefully we will build it with a bottom-up approach. So that's all I can say for now. But do stay tuned for the latest updates. Thank you.
Yeah. And also, we have been working with, in addition to national human rights institutions, those who are implementing NDCs, to show them the link with human rights, because human rights institutions have no idea about NDCs and vice versa. So we have been working with both groups to show connect the dots, as Victor said. Yeah. thank you so much for coming and for your comments. And if you would like to stay in touch, the information is on the Raoul Wallenberg Institute. And I'm in Wisconsin. It's not hard to find me. Thank you.